Learning about the collapse of my country, Lebanon, is most likely a way for you to prepare for the future collapse of your own country. But beyond that, there is an important reason to be concerned about Lebanon's collapse. It actually poses a systemic risk of ruin. Let me explain what systemic risks are, how they are dangerously and severely misunderstood in our society, how they can affect you, and why you should care about Lebanon's collapse. The majority of this video's content will be based on the ideas of Nassim Taleb, the famous Lebanese author who wrote Skin in the Game and Black Swan. Let us define ruin risk and systemic ruin risk. So first, there is a ruin risk when there is a non-zero chance that unrecoverable losses will occur. Consider, for example, a gambler who loses all of his money to the point where he has no money to play with. This is the gambler's ruin. Gambling can lead to financial ruin for those who do not manage their money well. Now, a ruin risk is considered systemic ruin risk when the harms that could result from some risk is actually on a very large scale. Ecocide, or the extinction of species on a global scale, would be systemic ruin risk in an economic system like our human societies. It can be difficult to determine whether the threat has a non-zero probability of causing systemic ruin. So here's the best trick for answering this question. You must actually determine whether the threat is additive or multiplicative. And only multiplicative threats will pose a systemic risk. To determine this for a specific threat, simply ask yourself. For example, if this threat occurs to a friend in Europe, does it increase the likelihood that the same threat will occur to you in America? If it does not increase the likelihood that it will happen to you, so the risk is most likely additive rather than multiplicative. We will give some examples and it will be much easier. Let's look for a few threats and see if they are additive or multiplicative. Do you think car accidents are additive or multiplicative? If your European friend dies in a car accident, your chance of dying in an American car accident do not increase, right? So the risk here is additive. Now let's give another example. Is it additive if people die in an avalanche in the French Alps? Is it more likely to kill you in an avalanche on Mount Lebanon, for example? Obviously not. So it's also additive. Now let's take a look at another very simple and modern example. Does it increase your chances of dying if a Chinese person dies from a novel virus because he got lucky with a bat and then a pangolin? Well, absolutely yes. This is why the CDC or public health was supposed to exist and not to be a letter trip propaganda agency. Viruses actually poses a multiplicative risk. That's why you should be concerned about them. Now let's move to a tricky one. Are nuclear power plants a systemic risk? Contrary to ecologists' claim, nuclear power poses no systemic risk. Chernobyl, for example, undoubtedly had health consequences in its surroundings, but not for the average American. Consider also this. The Chernobyl disaster did not increase the risk of US nuclear plants exploding. So no, nuclear power plants are risky, but they are only additive risks. Of course, the larger the nuclear plant, the greater the local impact if something goes wrong. But this does not imply a systemic ruin scenario. However, do you consider CO2 emissions to be an additive or multiplicative risk? It is multiplicative. If you increase your CO2 emission, you increase the greenhouse effect and through the climate change for yourself, as well as for your friend in Japan or South Africa, for example. So I know ecologists can't understand it because they have had too much soy milk. How dare you! But all sources of energy that emit more CO2 than nuclear energy, so almost all sources of energy, all of these sources are in fact exponentially riskier than nuclear energy. Here's another example. Does not liking and commenting on this video increase the likelihood that other people will not see it? Yes. So please avoid this multiplicative risk by clicking the like button and subscribing. Another way to look at it is that with additive risks, the risks remain with those who were willing to take it only. With the multiplicative risks, taking a risk increases the risk of your neighbor who never asked for anything. And this is why it's sophistry to compare the risk of dying from COVID to the risk of dying in a car accident. Now let us return to Lebanon's collapse. Why you should be concerned. Lebanon's bankruptcy is in fact a systemic risk. Simply put, Lebanon's economic crisis and bankruptcy as a result of a nationwide Ponzi scheme raises the risk of some banks in Europe or the United States or even countries going bankrupt. Maybe you think this is too far-fetched. This is the problem with the systemic risk. Non-linear effects must be considered. In pop culture, this is known as the butterfly effect, and this is why you should be concerned about the collapse or bankruptcy of any country regardless of size. Because the world has become so interconnected, the butterfly effect could be quite dramatic. Here are two recent examples of how the economic turmoil of small countries had a much larger impact than previously thought. Older people watching this video should now have flashbacks to the Asian financial crisis of the 1990s. The Asian financial crisis was a chain of events that began in the summer 1997 with Thailand and spread throughout many Asian markets. Thailand's decision to no longer peg the local currency to the US dollar triggered actually the crisis, which caused Thailand's currency to fall. Further currency depreciation then spread throughout East Asia, causing stock market declines, decreased import revenues, and also political unrest. At some point during this crisis, people were even afraid of a worldwide economic meltdown due to the financial contagion. You could now tell me that Thailand is a small, insignificant country, and that Asia was still in its infancy at the time, and that this cannot possibly happen in the Western world because America and Europe have competent entities like central banks. Well, Greece is another example for you. The problem stems from Greece's debt default, which occurred in this case around 2009. Since then, no one has wanted to lend to Greece because of its high level of debt and the large structural deficit at the national level. As a result, the country found itself in an extremely precarious situation, unable to roll over of this debt. But this entire financial system is based on the government bonds, and the Greek default could create a black hole in the financial system, sucking the entire system into it. Countries such as Portugal or Spain, or even Italy, were thought to be the most vulnerable to Greek default. Because of this fear of systemic risk, the Eurozone countries and the IMF decided to assist Greece and its bank. Again, to emphasize, a small country like Greece posed a systemic risk to the entire Eurozone. What is also interesting about Greece's economic problems is the impact on Greeks. The Eurozone and the IMF imposed capital controls to prevent a bank run in order to save Greek banks. Greek banks were closed for a month in the summer of 2015, and when they reopened, customers could only withdraw €60 per day. These restrictions were actually in place for nearly a year. In a similar vein, when Cyprus was facing a financial crisis a few years ago, depositors with more than €100,000 in the banks of Cyprus faced a 50% haircut. And here's the thing, the Lebanese were basically subjected to a mix of Greek and Cypriot consequences. We had a withdrawal limit, but also a nearly 90% haircut. As a result, we are now experts of the collapse experience. You can prepare for your possible future by watching this video of current daily life in Lebanon. And if you are concerned about the collapse of Lebanon for any other reason, please let me know in the comments. You can support me on Patreon, and we stay in touch on Twitter and Instagram.